أنا أشكر الجميع على الحضور
I would like to
وأهلا
thank
فيكم
everyone
جميعا.
for your
هذا
attendance
مسلسل
and
عن
welcome. This
حول
session
سياسة
is going
ترامب
to
في
be
اليمن
on
بين
Trump's Yemen
الضفتين أو
policy,
مخاطر تجدد الصراع.
escalation,
أنا ميسة
de-escalation,
شجاع الدين أدير هذه
and
الجلسة.
future prospects for
هذه
peace.
الجلسة
I'm
طبعا
Mesa
تأتي بعد
Shujaiddin. I'll be
قرابة شهر
facilitating the
من
session, and
الإعلان
this session
بوقف إطلاق
comes
النار
almost a month
الإعلان
after the
الذي أعلنه بشكل
announcement
مفاجئ
of a
ترامب في
ceasefire, the
6/8.
surprise announcement on the 6th of
وكان
May
الحدث فيه أنه
by
ستتوقف الهجمات
US
الأمريكية
President
بعد
Trump, in
7
which he
أسابيع
said that American
بعد
attacks
الضربات
will
العنيفة
end after
والزاحمة
7 weeks
وهي الموجة الثانية من الضربات الهجمات الأمريكية
of
على
significant and
على
heavy
الحوثيين
American
أو المعارك
strikes
في
against
الحوثي
the
في اليمن.
Houthis and in the areas
كانت
that are under the
الموجة
group's
الأولى
control.
كانت
The
عهد
first wave of
بايدن
attacks
لكنها كانت أخف
was under the
وأقل
Biden
حدة.
administration, but it was more
لكن بعد 7
limited and
أسابيع من
less
الموجة الثانية التي
damaging. But
تمت
after 7 weeks of
بمعاولة
the second
شديدة
wave or
جدا
second campaign under the
ومكثفة
Trump
جدا،
administration,
بعد 7 أسابيع تم الإعلان بشكل مفاجئ عن وقف
there was a
الهجمات
surprise
البحرية من
announcement
قبل
that the
الحوثيين،
attacks on the
وبالتالي
Red
وقف
Sea by the
الهجمات
Houthis would
الأمريكية
stop, and
على
so American strikes
الأهداف
against the
الحوثية وعلى
Houthis or
منظمة
against
الحوثي
Houthi
الحوثيين.
targets and in areas under their
سوف
control would also
نناقش
cease.
الحديث
Today we will
سيكون
discuss
أكيد في محاور متعددة، لأن سياسة
we're going to be
الأمريكية
discussing multiple
متحولة
dimensions
ومتغيرة
as
في
American
اليمن
policy has
ومؤثرة بكل
been
تأكيد.
dynamic and shifting and also very
سيكون معنا
influential in Yemen.
مجموعة من الضيوف
We'll have a group
الأكارم،
of
أستقدم
panelists.
فيهم السادة عابر الألي.
I'll start by
هي
presenting April Ali, who is
محللة سياسية مستقلة،
an independent
وكانت
political
تعمل
analyst
مستشار
who was an advisor
للمبعوث الأممي
to
مكتب
the
المبعوث الأممي
Office
في
of the
اليمن.
UN Special Envoy to Yemen.
ومن أيضا معنا ياسر
And
صالح
we
وهو
also
خبير
have Yasser
عسكري
Saleh, who
استراتيجي
is
في
a
عدن.
military analyst
ومعنا
and
أيضا أحمد
expert
ناجي وهو
residing in
مسؤول
Aden, and
محليا
Ahmed
في مبعث
Naji, who is
الأزمات
responsible
الدولية،
for the Yemen file
وأيضا الأستاذ
at
عبد
the
الغني
International
الرياني
Crisis
وهو
Group, and Mr.
كبير
Abdul Ghani
الباحث في جامعة
Al-Riani, a
صنعاء.
senior
أهلا فيكم
researcher at the
جميعا
Sana'a Center.
ونتشرف
Welcome,
فيكم
everyone.
ونبدأ الآن
Honored to have
الجلسة.
you here, and we can get started
أستاذة
with the
أبرل،
session. April, I would like to start
الحديث
with you.
موجه لك أو السؤال موجه لك
Or
أولا.
with the
تقييمك
first
لهذه
question, what is your
السياسة
assessment
الأمريكية؟
of
يعني
the
بايدن
US
رفع
policy
الحوثيين من
towards Yemen,
قائمة الجماعات
with
الإرهابية
Biden
ثم
removing
اعترف
the
بنيوم
designation of the
الحوثي،
Houthis, but
وأخيرا
then by the end of his
ترامب
term conducting
يعني
strikes
بدأ
against them, and then
بضربات
now
عنيفة ضد
Trump
الحوثيين ثم
starting with
وقفها
very
فجأة،
heavy campaign
وأخيرا
againست the
لما
Houthis,
زار
and then
المنطقة
suddenly
خارج
stopping it.
اليمن،
And
يعني
finally,
مهمة
when he visited
زيارة
the
ترامب
region,
كانت
the
خارج من
agenda
اليمن
of that
تماما.
visit did not
ممكن
include,
تشرحي
or
لنا
did
ما
not seem
الذي
to
يحدث
include
في
Yemen. Could you please
واشنطن؟
explain to us what is happening in DC?
So thank you, Mesa, and thank you for Sana'a Center for having me. I'm really happy to be on this panel with this group. Mesa, just so you know, somebody maybe can send me something in the chat to how to turn on translation, because I would like to hear the others in translation. I'm not using that right now. I mean, I understood you, but if somebody could send that in the chat, that'd be great. So I've been asked to start off the discussion, on the evolving U.S. policy in Yemen. And for those of us who have been following over the last, almost 5 months, this has been a wild ride. It's full of big announcements, grand promises, and sharp course changes, as you've mentioned. Ending in what many analysts have called a clear example of America First foreign policy. And this is this agreement you mentioned, the ceasefire, this very narrow one between Ansar Allah and the US to essentially stop shooting at each other in early May. So before I share some thoughts on why we've seen what we've seen and where we might be going in terms of US policy, let me lay out briefly the main policy decisions of the Trump administration that we've seen again over roughly 5 months. The first big announcement was the FTO, and this happened almost immediately. So in January 22, we had an executive order announcing that the administration would begin a process to redesignate Ansar Allah as a foreign terrorist organization. And by March 4th, they were indeed designated. Let me start by. And this, of course, comes with severe economic and diplomatic penalties to the group. And it was not surprising. The Trump administration had designated Ansar Allah as an FTO at the end of the last administration. And it was the Biden administration that reversed that decision to give space for a UN-backed settlement in Yemen that would have included Ansar Allah. So the decision to reinstate the FTO by Trump was a relatively easy and very public way to signal a more muscular approach to Ansar Allah. And but really before we saw the FTO, like what impact it would have economically on the ground, we had the next big policy announcement, and that was this significant stepped up air campaign called Operation Rough Rider against Ansar Allah that lasted just under 2 months. It started on 15 March. So we saw over 1,000 targets in Yemen, over $1 billion US spent on this campaign. And it was a really significant expansion of a more limited campaign that was defensive and then had a limited strikes inside of Yemen by the Biden administration. And the one under Trump really included an expanded targeting base, including Houthi leadership and dual use infrastructure. So we did see also some civilian casualties, and I'm sure we'll hear others speak about the impact of Rough Rider, so I won't do it. But in short, it did a lot of damage and it put pressure on Ansar Allah, but it did not deter Ansar Allah or change its behavior in terms of striking outside of Yemen. So with the price tag rising and forced preparedness on other fronts globally being strained and no end in sight, the Trump administration chose an off-ramp. And this is when we saw the next change. So there was a significant, escalation economically, militarily against Ansar Allah. And just as quickly as it started, it seemed to end. So we had this announcement of a U.S. Ansar Allah ceasefire brokered by the Omanis, and it was announced on the 6th of May, as you said. And to a large extent, this ceasefire announcement kind of returned to the status quo ante, at least in terms of Ansar Allah's position before the campaign began. So Ansar Allah continued to strike at Israeli territory, reserved the right to strike Israeli ships in the Red Sea until the operations in Gaza stopped. And the Ansar Allah would not fire at the U.S. if the U.S. did not fire at them, which is what they'd been saying throughout the campaign. So now we see the U.S. really wanting to put Yemen in the rearview mirror, I would say. And so after the ceasefire announcement, you saw President Trump make his first major international trip of his second term. He went to the Gulf. We saw him go to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and make these very splashy announcements of investments and deals there and military cooperation. I think what's notable for us is Yemen was not on the agenda. While it was before and got a lot of tension in the U.S., it was not on the agenda in this trip. There was no meeting between President Trump and the president of Yemen, the Presidential Leadership Council, even as President Trump did meet with the new president of Syria, Ahmed Shara. And just to add to all of these policy shifts and changes, it's also important to note the sharp reduction in U.S. assistance to Yemen as part of the dismantling of U.S. aid. And also just this week, there was announced a travel ban on Yemenis coming to the United States as part of 12 other countries that presented a security risk. So how to understand these policy shifts that we are seeing? I'll just make a couple of comments. One, I would say the FTO and the military escalation here it's very much Trump administration attempting to distinguish itself from Biden, to show its base and to others that they're getting things done differently, that they're strong and more decisive. If we look at what Biden was doing, he was already moving in the direction of possibly an FTO. Ansar Allah was designated as a specially designated global terrorist organization, which is less stringent. The operation had started, but Trump really took it to the next level, and very much with the FTO kind of closing off the opportunity for many parts of the roadmap that was under discussion as a political solution. I would say second point to note is that what's happening in Yemen under the Trump administration is as much about messaging Iran as it is about messaging Ansar Allah. So the FTO came in the context of a return to maximum pressure on Tehran to encourage them to return to the negotiation table on the nuclear deal. The military buildup around Yemen, the hardware used, the use of B-2 bombers in Yemen is very much a signal to Tehran as well. And the U.S. administration draws a clear straight line between the Houthis and Tehran, and they've openly said at various points that they would hold Tehran accountable for Ansar Allah's behavior. So for the Trump administration, there's a very, very straight and clear line. Third, I would say that, and this is important, this major shift that we saw towards rapid de-escalation, I think it's really a reflection of genuine policy differences within the Trump administration that we are seeing playing out. So within the administration, there are traditional kind of Republicans, Iran hawks that are willing to use instruments of national power, military force, far from U.S. shores. And then on the other side, you have the group that's kind of the isolationist, make America first foreign policy perspective. And this is very much represented by someone like J.D. Vance. And this group is going to be deeply skeptical of the use of military force far from U.S. shores and on an issue that's not directly related to core U.S. national security interests. And very importantly, this group is not interested in policing the commons. So they are not interested, for example, in having the U.S. bear a disproportionate burden for things like maritime security, which the U.S. has done in the past. And I think this debate between these sides was actually seen in this now notorious signal chat discussion within the administration on should they or should they not strike in Yemen. Fourth, to point out is that I think where we saw the U.S. end up, which is for now this ceasefire between the U.S. and Ansar Allah around the Red Sea, is really you see the preeminence of the J.D. Vance perspective, this more isolationist American first foreign policy playing out in Yemen. This is kind of shows where President Trump really kind of lies. This is somebody who's deeply skeptical of military intervention, adverse to anything that could look like a forever war in the Middle East, and would preference deal making. This deal prioritized immediate U.S. interests over collective responsibilities or allies. Again, it was just between the U.S. It didn't include European countries, others. It didn't have a broader solution to maritime security, for example. Strikes on Israel not only continued, but increased. So I will say that how quickly this shifted, though, from ratcheting up pressure to then de-escalation to now kind of just looking away from Yemen, may for many reinforce the perception that the U.S. is not consistent or a predictable or reliable partner, something that's been growing over time, not just under the Trump administration. It does signal, again, very clearly a lack of willingness to go through with costly military endeavors, without clear endpoints, and particularly ones that don't directly relate to what the U.S. and this administration perceives as core interests. And then also the deep preference for making deals. So I know I'm short on time. So where does it go from here? I think, the Trump administration is very clearly wants Yemen in its rearview mirror. So it wants to move on from Yemen. We've declared, victory and are looking at other places in the Middle East and other priorities. The Trump administration does not want to be involved in a long war or complicated domestic politics in Yemen. I think what you could see is a situation where the U.S. defers even more to Saudi Arabia's preferences in Yemen, as long as Yemen is not directly threatening U.S. commercial interests or military assets. Now, of course, within that space, there are many questions on how that could play out. Is this a containment strategy against Ansar Allah? Will the U.S. support a peace deal that maybe Saudi Arabia would like in Yemen? And under what circumstances would it be willing to lift or revise the sanction regime? Would the U.S. consider any support for, anti-Houthi forces? What about CT priorities? What about the Red Sea? I think even a bigger issue than that is it's not clear to me that even if the Trump administration would like to stay out of the fray in Yemen, that they are going to be able to over the long term. You can imagine many scenarios in which Ansar Allah or other events, will pull the U.S. back in to this problem set, even potentially militarily. I mean, we could see an escalation with Iran if Israel does a preemptive strike in Iran, or if you have a collapse of the negotiations there. You could see an attack on Israel from Ansar Allah that results in high civilian casualties and even the death of American citizens. And I think right now Ansar Allah is keeping its head down. It certainly has an interest in not having two fights with the U.S. and Israel at the same time. And so this very much benefits Ansar Allah. But I think in the future, you could see a revival of Red Sea attacks based on whatever was happening in the region with Palestine, with Gaza, or what was happening with Saudi Arabia, and even on U.S. assets. So to wrap up, I would just say that we've seen dramatic shifts in the Trump administration, not just in Yemen, right, but in defining a U.S. position in an evolving global order writ large. But I think interestingly in Yemen, where we have ended up right now is somewhat consistent with past U.S. policy. Interestingly enough, right, historically, Yemen has never been a priority, a consistent priority for U.S. policymakers looking at the Middle East. At times it gains attention. It's a punctuated crisis, a terrorist attack, or military action in the Red Sea. But otherwise, it's usually somewhat peripheral and has been seen through the lens historically of great power competition, Saudi Arabia's priorities and interests, opposing Iran or counterterrorism. So very much a security lens. And now we may be moving back into this. I mean, certainly the Trump administration would preference that, not having assets and too much attention on Yemen. And maybe even in a more extreme version where the U.S. is even more disengaged, right, and not willing to contribute to humanitarian relief or development.
Okay, thank you so much. And I will not ask you a follow-up question because it took somehow long. And so we can leave time for the question Q&A. Okay, I will go to Yasser, Ustad Yasser. كنت حابة
Yasser, I wanted to ask you about these recent American strikes. There were a lot of discussions during them, and there also seemed to be increased expectations that these strikes could support a broader ground defensive that would be carried out by coalition-supported forces. And there was mobilization, and it seems like this mobilization is still continuing on both sides even now. And there also seems to be the flow of arms also on both sides. Can you please tell us what is happening on the ground militarily? What developments you see? Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for the invitation and thank my other panelists for being here. I think it's important for us to start by defining the problem or understanding its root. It's clear that the United States of America did not have a clear strategy towards Yemen, and what's worse than having several strategies is not having a strategy at all. And I think that's been clear in the US's role in Yemen, starting with its inability to manage or deal with the conflict or propose any solutions to it. And after that, after the intervention in the Red Sea, they started Operation Prosperity Guardian, which was defensive in posture. And the most that it did was to carry out preemptive strikes. Preemptive strikes that did not end the threat, but only temporarily curbed the threat. After that, the new American administration came and changed the containment policy that it had used, that the previous American administration under President Biden used, focusing more on deterrence. But at the same time, this policy was not a clear and long-term deterrent. This was more of a short-term policy or approach, meaning that the United States, when it intervened in Yemen, it put in place three objectives, as stated by the President Trump, when he said that we want to convey a message to Iran, we want to eliminate Houthi leaders, and we want to curb or destroy or degrade the missile and drone capabilities of the Houthis. And I think these three objectives which had been announced, I think the main objective, which was to convey a message to Iran, was achieved, because over 15 days there were back channel meetings, and then around 20 days in, there was an announcement for an agreement to sit down for negotiations, and also within that 20 days there was a direct meeting or a round of talks between the United States of America and Iran. And so Yemen continues to be used or viewed either as a backyard of one country or as a proxy battleground with another, or maybe even as a bargaining chip, as Iran has been using it, or a way to pressure regional opponents, as the United States is using it now. And we've seen the US become less involved in dealing with the Houthi threat in Yemen or the Iranian threat in the Red Sea, as soon as Iran sat down to negotiate, and they were able to reach advanced stages that could help resolve the Iranian nuclear file. And on that front, with this temporary or partial stopping of operations, to prepare for or help create a suitable environment for Trump's visit to the Middle East, and also because it wanted to get a promise. The US got the promise to end attacks on the Red Sea, while the Houthis also wanted to take advantage of this to regroup and to rearm itself at the same time. And so the American strikes, when it comes to the limited impact, the impact of these strikes varied. There were maybe 30% maybe 30% was achieved on some of them, 50% in others, but there were also some strikes or some parts of it that could not achieve more than 20% even. What do you mean exactly by this? What are these specific parts that you mentioned? When we talk, for example, about the infrastructure, the military infrastructure of the Houthis, I think the impact on that was around 30%. When we talk about the impact that the strikes had on the logistics in Saada, for example, it might reach 50%. But when we talk about the logistics that the group inherited from the state armed forces that it took over, which was one of the largest militaries in the region, and these logistics bases have not been affected. I think have only been affected around 20%. So within a year from the strikes ending, we might find that the groups are able to go back to the same level that they were at before, with the same state or level of readiness that they had before the strikes. And I think this proves how limited the impact of these strikes were. And I think American policymakers understood this, especially since they did not try to create an active partner on the ground. They understand that airstrikes will not end the threat completely, and they will not be a full deterrent. However, all of this comes in light of several other contexts or developments. This conflict has been postponed for a later stage. Why? Because the Iranian nuclear file is the real sticking point between Iran and the US. And if the US, alongside Iran, is able to reach a final settlement for the nuclear file, we might then see the Houthis, or a part of the conflict in Yemen, being a part of that settlement and the Iranian proxies that remain. But if the Iranian nuclear file is not settled and consensus is not reached between the two sides, then we will see the conflict in Yemen renewing itself. Why? Because the United States needs a way to convey these messages to Iran. When we talk about the geography in Yemen, it's the same context that has made the IGRC, or the Iranian National Security Strategy. A part of that strategy is to have a proxy in Yemen to ensure that they can secure the southwestern front and helping increase its strategic depth to around 4,000 kilometers, with the Houthis controlling this area. This means that the military bases in the Horn of Africa and in the region are kept neutral, either through direct attacks by the IGRC from Iran, or by the attacks that can be carried out by the Houthis in Yemen. This means that we will see a return to or a returned escalation of conflict, especially if we take into account that the strategy that is in place, that Iran's strategy in the Red Sea, is not linked just to the Houthis or to Yemen, because the Houthis have played an advanced role of linking with other violent non-state actors in the Horn of Africa, and the Houthis are the ones managing this network, and they've become an advanced point for the IGRC to deal with groups in Eritrea, in Djibouti, and Somaliland, in addition to the close partnership, which reports have gone into detail, between the Shabab movement in Somalia and the Houthis. Meaning that tensions in the Red Sea will continue and lead to instability for international. So sorry, Asad, to interrupt. But my question here is this mobilization and arming within Yemen, specifically in Marib, the continued flow of arms, does this mean that we might see a ground defensive or a battle that could be started by the Houthis or by the coalition or the anti-Houthi forces? But what is the possibility of that scenario coming to be, of renewed escalation and ground defensives in Yemen? Yes, definitely. Yemen has now become closely linked to, even more closely linked to regional conflicts and regional influence. And so resumption of hostilities in Yemen might be more possible than we might realize. It might actually be more possible than other scenarios, than scenarios of containment or pressure or a political settlement or agreement being reached. Because the Houthis do, I think the reality shows us that the Houthis do not want sustainable peace. So, sorry, Mesa, what did you say? Other than that point of the Houthis not wanting peace, do you see military indicators of the preparations that would indicate that there are preparations for a battle? Yes, both sides in Yemen have their own preparations going on. The Yemeni government recognizes well that the conflict might start at any time if there are no longer any opportunities for peace. And so these preparations, these military preparations, are ongoing between the various actors. And even the American strikes have primarily targeted the areas on the front lines between the two sides after the Houthis mobilized a lot of their fighters on these direct fronts or front lines. And they were also able to achieve a bigger impact on these front lines because the logistics supply lines were transferred to the front lines within the country. And so the possibility of resumption of hostilities in Yemen is only a matter of time at this point, and many of the actors might see that as the only way out, especially since international and regional conflicts have not been resolved with the primary regional actors, and there was no regional consensus that was reached. And so the internal conflicts are a reflection of all of these developments. I believe that we can reach several conclusions based on these developments. The first is the importance of redefining Yemen for the United States. Yemen today, over the past few years, has been defined or has been viewed in a very complex way. And Yemen has not been a real partner in the security architecture of the region and also at the international level. And so Yemen has only been seen as a bargaining chip, as a proxy battleground, or even as a backyard of another regional actor. But I think it's important now for Yemen to be seen as an important part of the security architecture of the region and of securing commercial shipping lanes in the region as being part and parcel of international and global security and stability. And this is the reality, not just in Yemen, different countries as well, especially those on important shipping straits. There must be security and stability and a stable political system in these countries, because it will be immediately reflected positively or negatively on the global economy. The Houthis have recognized the significant negative impact they can have on the global economy with their attacks. And so it's important for Yemen to be seen through that lens, so that Yemen does not. Yemen is important geopolitically, is affected by and affects the world, and anyone who believes that they can keep themselves apart from the suffering and the conflict that has gone on in Yemen over the past 10 years, they've now started to see the threat that could arise out of Yemen. And everyone now views Yemen only through what interests they could try to protect. After their interests were affected, they've started to see Yemen more neutrally, more actively and more focused on restoring stability and security in this area. And this should have been the perspective of the international community from the very beginning. And one additional point: if Iran goes, if Iran improves its relationship with the Western nations on and this was the day that Iran discovered the problems with its missile program and wanted to strengthen its relationship with the Eastern Bloc or other powers as a partner, unlike its relationship with the West, because at the time it was in control of Syria and Iraq and Lebanon and Yemen, and there was acceptance by China and Russia for Iran to do that. And that's when the United States and the West wanted to try to defeat these proxies or these Iranian affiliate aligned groups. And so what could happen in Yemen if the Iran goes back to a relationship with the West? We might see the Houthis being used in a different direction in standing against the Silk Road project. And that would mean that the conflict in Yemen would continue. And so from 2020 to 2030, we might see there might be a restructuring of the world order. And unfortunately, Yemen has become a part of the theater of operations for these shifts. And one final point: anyone who views or recognizes the importance of security in Yemen and in the region must take into account all of these decisions in this strategic environment when making decisions or policies relating to Yemen. Thank you very much, Yasser. We'll now move on to Ahmed. Ahmed, before the attacks in the Red Sea, Yemen was very close to an agreement through the roadmap process. And this agreement, as we know, it would have been an agreement between the Houthis and the Saudis and was not an internal agreement between the Yemeni actors. But this agreement was ended because of the attacks and because of the designation of the Houthis as a terror group. And we also saw a more active diplomatic role by Oman, which led to ending the strikes by the United States and the attacks in the Red Sea. Can you tell us more about the regional perspective and the calculus of regional actors in Yemen, especially in light of the ongoing American-Iranian negotiations? Over to you, Ahmed.
بالإضافة إلى سؤالك دعيني كمان أطرح سؤال آخر.
Thank you very much. In addition to your question, I also had an additional question that is linked to the interventions by April and Yasser. The question is, during the military operations carried out by the US, there was a question of that this was seen as a golden opportunity for the anti-Houthi camp to carry out a ground offensive to try to regain control of some of these areas, especially since there was air coverage by the United States, and there were many indicators that showed that the US wanted a longer-term military operation. But what actually happened is that nothing was happening on the ground. And so to answer that question, we need to go back not to Yemen, but to regional capitals, which have witnessed a significant shift in their approach to Yemen. And primarily here, I mean Saudi Arabia, which unlike during the period in 2015 and 2016, when there was a lot of will for a military operation and for pulling the United States into participating in this military operation. At the time, but when the US participated, saw that Saudi Arabia wanted to take a step back and to push towards a diplomatic resolution. We also saw this role by other regional actors. Oman, yes, has been at the forefront of the negotiation, but Oman has also benefited from Saudi Arabia's role and also benefited from the Iranians in pressuring the Houthis, because Iran also has its own calculus that the actors within the axis of resistance have been weakened in other regions, and so it would not be reasonable for the Houthis to go into an open-ended confrontation. They also had their own calculus of trying to stop or ensure that the Americans would not stand with the Israelis in that confrontation. And so this shift in Saudi Arabia's strategy, I think, is the main headline in this topic. And the same thing applies to the UAE as well.
المجموعات المحسوبة على
We've also
الإمارات
seen some
تدفع بالخطاب
UAE-aligned
الإسرائيلي، ولكن
groups
هو تلويح أكثر
using
كونه حكي
escalatory
عن
rhetoric,
أنه
but this wasn't,
بالنسبة
we didn't
للإمارات
see any
إمداد
impact from this rhetoric on the ground. For
يناير
the
فبراير
UAE after
2022
January or February
أولويته
of
الرئيسية هو عدم
2022, its
الاشتراك
main
في الحرب
priority
اليمنية،
has
لأنه
been not to get more involved in the
الانخراط
conflict in
مكلف
Yemen because
وله
its
أبعاد كبيرة
involvement
جدا.
would be costly and would have
فالكل ذهب
significant
باتجاه انه يكون في حل
impact. And so
دبلوماسي.
everyone was
كيف
heading
بيكون شكل
towards a
الحل الدبلوماسي؟
diplomatic
هذا
solution.
السؤال
What would
جدا
this
آخر.
diplomatic or political solution look like?
وبنفس الوقت في
That's a
نوع من
different question.
التحوط
But at the
والاحتواء،
same time,
انه
there
هي
also seems to be an
حالة
attempt to
إشكالية
contain the
اليمن،
situation
وبالتالي
because
الدخول
the
فيها
problem in Yemen
هي دخول
seems to be
بفخ
too
جديد، وربما
complex
بيكون
to get
في كثير
involved
من
with and
الانعكاسات على أمن هذه الدول.
might lead to
وعشان أجاوب
problems
على هذا
with the
السؤال في
security
التحول
in
من
these countries if they were to be
استراتيجية
involved.
التدخل
And so to answer
العسكري
this question
الكامل
about
إلى
this
استراتيجية
shift
الاحتواء،
from a policy of
خصوصا
military
بعد
confrontation to a
دخول
policy
السعودية
of
في مفاوضات
containment,
مباشرة
and
مع
especially
الحوثيين.
after Saudi Arabia went into
لازم
direct
نجاوب على بعض
negotiations with the
أو
Houthis.
نسلط الضوء على بعض
And
النقاط.
for
أول
us to answer
شيء
that question,
تعتقد
it's important for
السعودية
us to
أو
take a
غيرها
few
كمان من
things into
الدول
account. The
الإقليم
first is
إنه
that Saudi
أي
Arabia and other
عملية
regional
عسكرية
actors believe
واسعة،
that
إن كان
any
على مستوى
broad
توسع العمليات العسكرية اللي كانوا
military
يقوموها
operation,
يقوم
whether
بها
by
الأمريكان أو موضوع
expanding
العمليات
the
البرية،
operations carried out by the
بشكل أو
US or
بآخر
through a ground
ستنعكس
offensive,
على الأمن
will
القومي لهذه الدول،
will
خصوصا
have an
أنه
impact
توسع
on the
العمليات
national
في البحر
security of
الأحمر
these states because expanding operations on the Red
سيتوسع
Sea
إن كان على مستوى نطاق المسطح المائي أو على
will
مستوى
expand
الذهاب
throughout
باتجاه القرن
the,
الأفريقي
the sea
وما إلى
itself
ذلك،
and also
وبالتالي هذا
possibly
عبء
expand
جديد
into the
بيضاف
area of the Horn of
للأمن القومي
Africa,
لهذه الدول.
which is an additional burden on the national
النقطة
security
الثانية لها علاقة
of these states. The
بالمفاوضات، يعني
second point
السعودية
was
خلال سنتين أو
related to
3
the
سنوات
negotiations.
متواصلة في
Saudi
الخطط
Arabia, over the
بدون
past
الحديث
2 or 3
المفرط
years of negotiations during which it was able to reach the
جمدت
roadmap,
وانتهت،
the roadmap
يعني
that we hear now that the
بظل حديث
roadmap
يعني
has
في
been
نوع من
suspended or has
التكهنات،
been frozen, but these
ولكن
are all just guesses
قد
at this
ربما
point.
يتم التعديل عليها، قد
And there
ربما
might be some
يتم الذهاب إلى
changes
أخذ
that will be
رخص من
made to the
الأمريكان
roadmap. The
بموضوع
Saudis might want to
يعني
get approval
الحديث
from the
على
Americans
جوانب اقتصادية
to
تتجاوز ال FTO
discuss
مثلا
economic
والعقوبات
issues
الاقتصادية،
that
يعني على
would
سبيل
be
المثال
affected
اليوم
by the
في
FTO
عقوبات
and
كثيرة على
relevant
إيران،
sanctions. Today, for
ولكن
example, there are many
بنجينا نشوف مثلا
sanctions
علاقة
against
إيران
Iran, but if
الاقتصادية
we
مع
look at
الإمارات كبيرة
Iran's
جدا، عندما
economic
تغيرت
relationship with the
العلاقة مع
UAE,
الشركة
it's
الكبيرة
significant. We have
وتشتغل
tens
في
of
الإمارات،
thousands of
يعني
Iranian
في رخص
firms
عادة في
operating
استثناءات
out of the UAE.
في
So there's
الحالة.
always
إلى أي
exemptions
مدى
or
السعودية
licenses
ممكن
that are
تروح
given. And so
بهذا
to what
الاتفاق مع
extent could
الحوثيين
Saudi Arabia, through its agreement with the
يعني
Houthis,
ما ينجح
head in
خلال
that
بلد
direction in
تسوية
a way
ولو
that
بحدود
would
هذه
ensure
الدول،
the
بحيث أن
success of
تضمن
this settlement,
حالة
even at
من
the bare minimum, to ensure
الاستقرار أو
a
تأطير خلينا
state of
نقول
not
هدنة
stability,
الأمر
but
الواقع
maybe
الموجود
a
على
de
الأرض،
facto,
دون
a
الذهاب إلى
continued
عمق
de facto
الحالة ومحاولة
ceasefire without actually
الحديث عن ما الذي
resolving
يجب أن يعمل في المسألة الداخلية
the
اليمنية.
problem at its core when it comes to the internal
بالنسبة
situation in
للعمانيين
Yemen.
بكل تأكيد
With regards to the
كانت
Omanis,
التقاطة بالنسبة لهم
this
موضوع
was an
هذه
opportunity
التسوية
for
اللي
them,
حصلت
this
ما
this
بين
settlement
الحوثيين
that
وما بين
occurred between the
الأمريكان،
Houthis
لأنه
and the United
الأمريكان
States,
دخلوا
because the Americans
بعملية عسكرية ورافعين يعني
were
إطار الضغط العسكري
participated in a
لأعلى حد،
military operation
وبنفس
and
الوقت
had
بالنسبة للشروط
maximalist
فعلوا شرط يعني بسيط
objectives
جدا،
or
إنه
demands.
فقط
But
نحتاج
with
من
regards to the
الحوثيين أنهم
criteria,
يقولوا إنه
the only
بنوقف
thing they asked,
عملياتنا
they
العسكرية
wanted
في
the
البحر
Houthis to say
الأحمر.
that they will stop
كانت
their
فرصة
military
بالنسبة
operations
للعمانيين
in Yemen.
أنهم
So this was an
يتدخلوا، إنه
opportunity
أوكي
for the
خلص
Omanis
العماني
to intervene,
الحوثيين يقولوا إنه
to
إحنا
to show
مبنى
that yes, the
بوتيرة في
Houthis are
البحر
saying that
الأحمر. هم أصلا من
they're not
ديسمبر
going to carry out strikes in the
العام
Red Sea.
الماضي
And since
الحوثيين ما
December of
أطلقوا
last
ما
year, the
أطلقوا أو
Houthis,
من يناير بتحديدا
or since
ما أطلقوا
January,
عمليات عسكرية باتجاه البحر
the
الأحمر
Houthis
ضد
have not carried
سفن
out
تجارية.
military
كان
operations in the Red Sea against
يعني
commercial
العودة
vessels.
للتصعيد
The return
محصور
to escalation
بالسفن
was limited
الإسرائيلية،
to Israeli
خصوصا مع
vessels,
انهيار الهدنة في غزة،
especially with the collapse of
وبالتالي
the
الذهاب
ceasefire in Gaza.
للتصعيد العسكري من الأمريكان هو نوع من رفع السقف
And
لإنجاح
so
تسوية
this
معينة، وهذا اللي
military
حصل في نهاية
and the
المطاف.
military
طبعا
escalation
اليوم لما
against the
بتيجي تشوف
Americans was an
الأمريكان
attempt
بيتعاملوا معها
to
إنه
achieve that. And
انتصار،
the
إنهم
Americans are dealing with it
حققوا
as
انتصار
a
على
victory, that they
احتواء
were able to
الحوثيين،
achieve a victory because the
التزموا
Houthis
بعدم
have committed
التصعيد أو
to not
الاستمرار
escalating
في الهجمات في البحر الأحمر.
or continuing their attacks
الحوثيون يعتبروه
in the Red
انتصار
Sea.
أيضا،
The
كل
Houthis
واحد
also
عنده
see it as a
نسخته من
victory,
الانتصار،
and each one has their own,
باعتبار
each side
أنهم
has their
استطاعوا
own
تحييد الأمريكان عن هذا الشيء.
perspective on what that would look like because they have been able
بالنسبة
to keep the US
للإيرانيين زي ما قلت
neutral on that. With regards to the
وهذا ربما
Iranians, because, as I've said, and this might be linked to what both April and Yasser spoke about, that one of the
أو مؤشرات نجاح
indicators of the
في
success in the agreement
اتخاذ
between the
العمليات الأمنية
Houthis
هو
and the United
التطور
States
الإيجابي في
is the
المفاوضات ما بين
positive
الأمريكان
development in the
والإيرانيين.
negotiations between
ولكن
the
السؤال اللي
Americans
بيطرحه
and the
السؤال هو
Iranians. But
ماذا
the
لو
question
حصل
that
انتكاسة في
arises
هذه
is,
المفاوضات؟
what if those
هل نشهد
negotiations were to stall?
عودة لعمليات
Would
عسكرية
we
خصوصا
see a resumption of
إنه
military
أمريكا في اليمن
operations, especially since
تقود
the
حربين،
US in Yemen
تقود حرب عسكرية
is now
من خلال
fighting
هذه
on two
العمليات،
levels. It has a
وتقود
military
حرب
conflict
اقتصادية ضد
through
الحوثيين
these
واللي هي متوقفة حاليا،
operations, and
واللي
also
هو
the
موضوع
economic
الاف تي
warfare
او،
against the
موضوع
Houthis, which
العقوبات
has not
الاقتصادية
stopped.
اللي
The
تتكثر
FTO and
بشكل
the economic
مستمر.
sanctions, which
وعندها
are
التنسيق الكبير
increasing.
جدا مع
And the US
الإسرائيليين
also
بدون
has a high
دخل،
level
وهذا
of
الكلام
coordination
يعني
with the
من
Israelis, who
أمس
are now
مثلا شفنا
more involved.
الإسرائيلي
And we
أول
saw this
مرة
yesterday. The Israelis, for the
بيدخلوا
first time,
على خط البحر الأحمر
are
وبيضربوا
are
ضربات
involved
ضد
in the Red
الحوثيين
Sea
من
and carrying
خلال
out strikes against the Houthis
البحرية التابعة لهم. وبالتالي
through the
السؤال هو كيف
attacks by the
بيكون
Israeli
شكل
Navy. And so the
الحالة
question is,
مستقبلا. هذا
what would this
بيختلف
look like
ويتحدد
in
جميع
the
الأمور.
future? I think
بالنسبة
that's a bit harder
للنقطة
to answer what
الأخرى،
that situation would
واللي
look like.
باعتقادي أنا ساعدت في هذا
A
التحول
point that I think helped in
الإقليمي
this
تجاه الاحتواء وليس
regional
الحل
shift
العسكري
towards
هو عدم
containment and
الثقة
not
الكاملة
military
والمطلقة بإدارة ترامب.
and
إدارة
not a
ترامب
military
هي
offensive,
إدارة
is because of the lack of
يعني
trust
transactions في
in
هذه
the Trump
الصفقات
administration. It's a
الكذا،
very
ولكن
transactional
كانوا محقين من البداية
administration.
إنه أوكي
But
قد
they were
يبدأ
also
ترامب عملية
they knew
عسكرية
that
ولكن يمكن
Trump
أن
might
تتوقف
start a
في أي
military
لحظة.
operation, but it might stop at any moment,
وبالتالي
as
إذا
they
وضعوا
saw that it did.
كروتهم،
And so if
نحن
everyone
نتكلم على
puts their
السعودية،
chips, and here I'm
الإمارات أو
talking about
غيرها من
Saudi
الدول
Arabia or
المتاحة
the
الميزان،
UAE or any
في
other
سلة ترامب
state that
ممكن
might
يخذلوهم في
be
منتصف الطريق.
that might have the will, if they put all of their eggs
العودة
in the Trump
للخلف بالنسبة
basket, they
للأمريكان سهلة،
might
بس بالنسبة للدول الإقليمية
find
صعبة
themselves in a
جدا،
difficult
يعني مش
position.
ممكن يرجعوا
Going
للخلف،
back would be
على
easy for the
اعتبار إنه بيكون
Americans, but it would
في
be much more difficult for
إشكاليات
regional
كبيرة
actors.
جدا. وكمان ال الهروب الكلي من يعني أشهر طويلة من المفاوضات مع الحوثيين، هذا بكل تأكيد بيكون
And also
له آثار سلبية.
the long
وفي
period
كمان
of negotiations
تفضيل
with
أو
the
خلينا
Houthis that
نقول
they've already
اعتبار مهم
conducted.
جدا
And there's
يؤخذ بعين
also an
الاعتبار
important
أخذه من
consideration that
السعودية،
needs
إنه
to be taken into
اليوم
account, at
الضغط
least
على
by
الحوثيين
Saudi Arabia.
قائم،
There
والحوثيين
is
مع
pressure on
مرور
the
الوقت
Houthis today, and the
بيجدوا أنفسهم
Houthis
محاصرين
over time will
وبحاجة
find themselves more and
للسعودية
more
وغيرها،
isolated and
لأنه
more
خصوصا
in
مع
need
وجود
of Saudi
التسليح
Arabia
مع
and
وجود
others,
العقوبات.
especially with the
هذا
designation
بالنسبة
and the
لهم
sanctions.
كافي، يعني
And so
ممكن
this for
نخلق
them
حالة
is
من
sufficient for Saudi Arabia, as it could
الضغط
create,
على الحوثيين يحقق كثير من
it could
المطالب،
help create
وبنفس الوقت
pressure on the
يدفع الحوثيين
Houthis
انهم
and
يتراجعوا
achieve many
خطوات
of their demands, and
الى
also
الخلف.
force the Houthis to take
النقطة
steps back, which is in
القبل
Saudi Arabia's
الأخيرة
interest.
هي
And
موضوع
the
تبدل
final, the second
إيران
to last
وموقفها.
point is
يعني
also the shift
كانت
in
السعودية
Iran and the
وبعضها
position
يعني بعض
towards it.
دول
Saudi
المنطقة
Arabia and
عندها
other countries in
موقف
the
حدي
region
تجاه إيران،
had
على
a
اعتبار أن
very
إيران
clear
متوغلة في
and
سوريا، في
sharp
لبنان،
position towards
في
Iran
العراق
because of their
في
role in
اليمن.
Syria and Lebanon and Iraq and in
شفنا
Yemen.
مجموعات المحور أضعفت،
But we've seen how the axis of
أزيلت يعني من
resistance
سوريا على
has
سبيل
gotten
المثال،
weakened,
أضعفت
has
في
been
لبنان،
removed in Syria, has
في
been
إيران نفسها
severely
كمان
weakened in Lebanon,
أعانت بشكل كبير
and
في
Iran
لبنان.
itself also
وبالتالي قبول
has
إيران
suffered.
الضعيفة
And so
هو
accepting a
شيء
weak Iran
يعني مقبول بالنسبة
is
لنا،
something that
يعني
is
أو شيء
seen as
مرحب به
acceptable
بالنسبة
or
لهذه
even
الدول.
welcomed by
عدم
these
الذهاب إلى
states.
القطيعة الكاملة معها،
And so not
وبالتالي
going into a
فكرة
full,
الترحيب بالتسوية
not
مع
isolating it
الحوثيين
fully. And so
صار
welcoming this
اسمه
settlement with the
أعلى من أي
Houthis,
وقت مضى.
I
أما
think, has
النقطة
become
الأخيرة
more
فلها
likely
علاقة
than
بحرب
any
غزة.
previous time. And the final point
فحرب
is
غزة بالنسبة
related to the Gaza
للسعودية
war.
وبالنسبة
The Gaza
لكل
war
الدول
for Saudi
الإقليمية مصر
Arabia and for many
وغيرها
regional actors like Egypt and
هي
others,
هي الأساس، يعني
it
هي
is
مثل
at the core
الأفاتار
of
اللي
everything.
بيحرك
It's the
القصة كلها
avatar
في
that
المنطقة.
is in control of
فبالتالي الذهاب
many
بحربين
of the other
بنفس الوقت
developments. And
مش
so
من
going
صالح
into two
كثير من الدول
conflicts at the same
الإقليمية.
time is not in the interest
وبالتالي
of many
التهدئة في
regional
اليمن
actors. And so
وضغط
de-escalation
من
in
أجل
Yemen
إنجاح تسوية
and
سياسية،
pressuring to ensure the
وبنفس الوقت
success
الضغط
of
على
a political settlement,
نتنياهو
and while at
العمل
the
مع
same
الولايات
time
المتحدة الأمريكية
pressuring
لإنجاز اتفاق
Netanyahu
يطفئ إطلاق
and
النار في
working with
غزة
the US
هدف تسعى له دول المنطقة.
for a
وبالتالي
ceasefire in Gaza
مش
is the
حابة تروح
objective
إلى
of the
تصعيد ضد
regional actors.
الحوثيين في الوقت
And so
اللي
they
فيه
do not want to escalate against the
حرب في
Houthis
غزة وفي
at a
تصعيد
time when there
إسرائيل
is an
في غزة. فهذا
ongoing
كان
conflict and
واضح
Israeli
بالنسبة لكثير من
escalation in
الدول
Gaza. And so I think
ويؤخذ
this was
بعين
very clear
الاعتبار،
for
والمسألة
many
مش مرتبطة
countries, and
بمسائل
it's something that
سياسية
needs to be
وأمنية
taken into
فقط،
account. And it's
ولكن
not
لها
just a
علاقة
purely
بالببليك
military or
اتيتيود
security issue, but it's also linked to public opinion and public attitudes. Carrying out the conflict against the Houthis at a time when the Houthis are using the slogan of Gaza for their military operations is something that
أو غير يعني محمود بالنسبة لكثير من الدول.
would not be accepted by many of the regional actors. Thank you.
أشكرك على موضوع حرب غزة.
Thank you very much for bringing up the Gaza war, because the Houthis have linked their intervention with the Gaza war. Do you think that this has expanded their appetite for regional intervention? Do you think that this is something that they'll be
قصدك
encouraged
من
to do in
قبل
the future?
الحوثيين
You
تجاه
mean by the
إيران؟
Houthis towards becoming more involved
هو
regionally?
بالنسبة للحوثيين
Well,
يعني
for the
أنا دائما
Houthis,
أقولها
and this is
يعني
always
يشعروا
something that
أنهم
I've
صاروا
said, the
أكبر من
Houthis
الجغرافيا
feel like they've now
اللي
grown
بيسيطروا
bigger
عليها
than
لأنه وصلوا
the
إلى
areas that
مرحلة
they control. The Houthis have gotten
قالوا
to a
إحنا
point
مسيطرين على الشمال،
where
ذهبوا
they're in
باتجاه
control of
البحر
the
الأحمر،
north. They started
وذهابهم باتجاه
expanding
البحر
towards the
الأحمر
Red Sea,
طبعا
and their
ليست له
expansion
علاقة
towards the Red Sea,
بغزة، ولكن في شك آخر له
part of
علاقة
it is linked to Gaza, but
لابد من
part of it
فرض
is also
السيطرة
linked
في
to
المسطح المائي من أجل
their
أن نقول إنه مش
attempt
إحنا
to
سيادتنا استمرار
impose their
سيادتنا في البحر،
influence
وبدأوا
in the sea
يلعبوا
as well.
دور اللي هو أبعد
And
من
the Houthis
هذا
have started to
باتجاه
play a role
مناطق
even
أخرى،
beyond
يعني
that,
إحنا مش
trying to
فقط يعني
expand
هذا
into
ربما
other areas. And
إنسائي
this
في
is
الفترة
something that
الماضية.
might have
كان
been,
الحديث دائما بيروح إنه الحوثيين
that people might have
بيتلقوا
thought. People always
دعم من حزب
believe that
الله من
the Houthis were
الإيرانيين.
recipients of
اليوم
support
الحوثيين
from the
بيروحوا ناحية
Iranians or
إنه
from
لا
Hezbollah.
إحنا
But
اللي
now the
نعمل،
Houthis are trying to show
إحنا اللي
that we're the
نقدم هذا
ones
الدعم،
providing
وإحنا
the
اللي
support.
صرنا ناظمين له،
We're the
هذا إن كان
ones
على
who are
مستوى
able
مجموعات المحور
to
الجغرافي
influence
اللي
it, whether
انتهى،
within the
نتكلم
axis of
على
resistance
مثلا
in the areas that they're control.
مساندة
So, for
حماس،
example,
أو إن كان مثلا
supporting
كما كان
Hamas,
في فترة من الفترات على
or
حزب الله
also
كانوا
when there was
بيساعدوا
pressure on
تجاههم،
Hezbollah,
أو
they
من
would
خلال
escalate on
تكوين
their end,
شبكة
or by
خاصة
forming
بهم
their
في
own
مناطق مثلا
networks
الساحل
in
الأفريقي،
the
إنه
areas
هذا الدور
close by,
هو
like the
دور
Horn of Africa.
يعني الحوثيين يشعروا إنه
And this is a
يعني
role that the Houthis
مهم
feel
جدا إنهم
is
يلعبوه.
is a
كنت
very
بنقاش
important role
معك
for them to play.
ميسا
I remember a
على
discussion that
موضوع
we had,
إنه
Mesa, on the topic of
كيف إن الحوثيين عندهم هذا
how
الطموح
the
اللي أحيانا
Houthis have
راح
these
يتجاوز إيران،
aspirations,
يعني
and at times
وعلاقتهم مع
their
إيران مش إنه
aspirations might
إيران
go
تأمرهم،
beyond
لا،
Iran.
قد
And the
ربما
relationship
يكون
with Iran is
العكس،
not one where Iran
يذهبوا
tells them what to
باتجاه
do, but no, it might actually be
التحالف
the other
مع
way
إيران،
around.
لأنه إيران
That they might
بتعطيهم
want
مثلا
to
الأسلحة، بتعطيهم كثير
ally
من
themselves with
التقنيات
Iran because
من
Iran
أجل
is giving
تحقيق
them arms
طموح
and
خاص بجماعة
the
الحوثي
technology that they
بالتأكيد،
need
وبكل تأكيد
to
تستفيد إيران من
achieve
هذا
the
الشيء لأنه في
aspirations.
حالة
And definitely,
تصادم
yes, Iran is
يعني قوي
benefiting
جدا
from
لدى
this
الحوثي.
relationship, but it might actually be
والسيناريوهات
a,
المستقبلية مفتوحة لا
and
زال.
so the future scenarios
شكرا
are
كثير يا
still
أحمد. أنتج الأستاذ عبد
difficult to
الغني.
try to predict. Thank you very much,
أستاذ عبد
Ahmed. We'll now
الغني
move on to Abdul Ghani.
أنت الآن
يعني
ستعطينا
Abdul Ghani, you're
النظرة
going to
الأخيرة
give us
والإجمالية لكل هذا وانعكاساتها
a
على
broader
الأرض
perspective of all of these
في اليمن
developments and the impact that they would
وانعكاساتها على
have
الدول
on the
المحلية
ground in
الداخلية.
Yemen, as well
تفضل.
as the impact that it would have
شكرا
on
جزيلا.
local actors in the country.
أنا
Thank
عندي
you very
ملاحظة
much.
سريعة.
I had a few
اشتي
quick
أقول
comments that I wanted to
رأيي
make.
لماذا تدخلت أمريكا
I wanted
في
first
الملف
to
اليمني
talk
من
about
البداية.
why I think the
وأنا في
US got
رأيي
involved in the Yemeni
أن
file in the first
الأمريكان
place. I think
كانوا
that the
حريصين
Americans
على
were
التدخل
keen
في اليمن في
to
موضوع البحر
intervene in
الأحمر
Yemen and
لكي
on the Red
يخففوا
Sea
الضغط
to
ضغط اللوبيا الصهيوني عليهم
decrease the
في
pressure
الداخل
by
لضرب
from
إيران.
APAC to carry
فكان
out a strike
هذا
against
جزء
Iran.
من
And I believe that
استراتيجيتهم
this
في
was a
التعامل
part of
مع
the
ملف
American
إيران.
strategy to deal with in
وفي
dealing with
رأيي أنه
the Iranian file.
الأمر لا زال قائم.
And I
كما
think the
قالت
situation
أبريل
is still in
هناك توجه
that's still what the situation is. As
جاد
April said,
نحو
there's a serious
الانعزالية ولا ترغب
isolationist
أمريكا
streak
أن
where
تستمر في
the
القيام
US does
بدور
not want to
الشرطي
continue to
العالمي.
play the role of the world
لكن في
police.
النهاية
But at the
ما
same
دامت
time, as long
المواجهة
as
بين إيران وأمريكا
the confrontation
دائمة
between Iran and the US is ongoing,
واحتمال أن الضغط
and the
الصهيوني يزداد
possibility
على
of increased
البيت الأبيض
Zionist pressure on the
في
White
يعودوا
House,
للضرب في اليمن
they
للتخفيف
could
من
go
ذلك
back
الضغط.
to carrying out strikes in Yemen to try to
في
decrease
رأيي أيضا
that
أنه
pressure.
الأمريكان
I also think that the
لم
Americans
يكونوا مجهزين
were
دخلوا بدون خطة
not
واضحة.
prepared. They went in
وهذا
without a
الكلام اللي
clear
قالته
plan,
أبريل
and that's
وياسر
also something
أيضا
that
أنه
both
لم
April
يكن
and
هناك
Yasser
خطة واضحة
said during
وكانوا
their intervention.
يعتقدون
There
أن
wasn't a
المسألة
clear plan.
يعني
I think they might
تنفض
have thought that maybe
والحوثي
a
يتراجع.
strike or a
لم
few strikes and the
يتوقعوا
Houthis
أن
would be
الحوثي
deterred,
مستعد
but I don't think
يقبل
they
الضربات
expected that the
على المنشآت
Houthis were
المدنية
ready to
بهذا
accept
الشكل.
the strikes that were
لكن
carried out on
سؤال
civilian
هل معقول يعني
infrastructure.
أمريكا
But this
بهذه
leads to a question:
السذاجة يعني
could that really be the case that
السعودية دخلت قبلها
Saudi Arabia has already been
ستضرب
fighting
الحوثي مع
for
أسد
7 or 8
الشهداء
years carrying out
الجندية
strikes against the Houthis, and the
والهزيمة
Houthis did not
السريعة
collapse,
اللي
or
توجهوا له.
this did not lead to the type of
هي
defeat
مش
that the
يعني
Saudis were
صح
expecting. So
أنها
why
إذا
did the
كنت تقول هي
Americans expect
هزيمة
that? Yeah, I think to a certain extent it could be seen
لأمريكا
as
بالعكس يعني
the US not being victorious or even being defeated, but I don't think they expected the ability of the Houthis to sustain or to sustain strikes on civilian infrastructure. I don't think people don't really understand that the Houthis don't care if there are electricity outages or there are fuel shortages or even if food is not delivered. I think they might have thought that this kind of pressure might lead to a result, but that did not happen. But if they have to pressure Iran or to decrease the pressure by the Zionist lobby on them to carry out strikes in Iran, then they might go back to doing the same thing, which also will not lead to any real results. I think Yasser's perspective on the impact of these strikes, I think it's very difficult to really understand what the Houthis have for us to be able to gauge what impact has been achieved. But let's keep in mind that for the Houthis to continue in their operations, they don't need much. They need drones and they need missiles, hoping that they'll be able to remain until an agreement either between Iran and the US or between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia is achieved, so that they can come out of it as the victor. Whereas the rest of the arms that the Houthis have, they only need them for their internal battles or their internal conflict. In reality, the local conflict, the Houthis have a significant advantage in that battleground. And not just in arms, because they've taken control of the arms that were under control of the state beforehand, but the Houthis also have the logistical and the leadership ability to carry out offensive campaigns, whereas the government and its conflicting and fragmented components without unified leadership cannot carry out any real ground offensive, even if they are sufficiently armed. And this takes us to the final point, the point on regional actors. Saudi Arabia and the UAE specifically. I believe that Saudi Arabia will continue dragging its feet and will not move past the roadmap or achieve any project in it until it gets the air defense batteries that it's currently negotiating with the United States on. And then the Saudis will might reconsider their position. With regards to the UAE doesn't really need to do anything on Yemen now, because their job in 2019 they said mission accomplished. We've achieved the objective that we set out to achieve. And now it's important for us to understand what that objective was. The objective was not to return the internationally recognized government to Sana'a, but to take control of the south, so that the UAE can
ممر إلى البحر المفتوح. فما دام الإمارات حققت أهدافها في 2019 فليست بحاجة للعودة بأعمال حربية إلا إذا تعرضت.
There's no need for the UAE to go back to military operations unless it is attacked. I think for Saudi Arabia is in a very difficult position, however, because it does not have the necessary air defense systems or batteries in place. And so I think that Saudi Arabia will continue to give in to the Houthis until it receives these air defenses, and then they can start discussing these things with the Houthis from a position of power. I have a question. You mentioned Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the role that they've played, but recently, over the past 2 years, there was a somewhat of a de-escalation between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but it's clear that the escalation, and I mean a de-escalation when it comes to Yemen, but the escalation has risen again. We've seen very clear escalation between the two states in Hadramaut, for example. Is this a reflection of other tensions that we see in the region, or does it reflect that both countries are becoming more active in Yemen and might have competing or conflicting perspectives? I think it'll be difficult to answer that question for a very simple reason, because there are two levels of the conflict. The first level, which is very important for the UAE, is how it can be useful to the US. Whenever they have an opportunity whenever the UAE has the opportunity to do something that bolsters its relationship with the US, then it never hesitant to do so.
أي قرارات تخص أمريكا
And so any decision linked to the US that would give an opportunity for the UAE to provide services to the US, then the UAE will take that path. And I think that that'll be difficult for us to try to predict. Secondly, with regards to the UAE's relationship with Saudi Arabia, the UAE never directly confronts Saudi Arabia. Whenever the tensions arise between the two, Emirati officials try to make the necessary concessions, and then after a while they go back to where things were before. So with regards to Yemen, their objective has been achieved. And that is not allowing Saudi Arabia to take control of a path through eastern Yemen to the open sea in the Indian Ocean, and also because the UAE has formed several militias that are difficult to coordinate amongst. And so the UAE might want the situation in Yemen to continue to be unstable so that the Saudis are preoccupied with it for a very long time. I had one final question to you, and I also encourage our audience to raise their hands or to ask questions in the chat. But I wanted you to answer this question quickly before we allow that. Do you think that the Houthis, because of the increased economic pressure on them due to the FTO and sanctions, might the Houthis decide that military escalation is their only way out? There's no doubt about that, not just because of the economic pressure, but also because the Houthis have started to complain more and more about Saudi Arabia dragging its feet about the roadmap, and the Houthis are in need of escalation. But it will be in their interest to escalate in a way that does not harm the relationship that they've been building with Saudi Arabia. And so I do not think that they will target Marib, despite the significant mobilization of fighters in the Marib front. But I think that the escalation will be in other front lines so that the Houthis can make military progress without destroying the relationship that they've been building with Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much, Abdul Ghani. We'll now open up the floor for questions. We have 15 minutes remaining. April, I'll start with you.
There is a question for you in the chat, in the Q&A, that if the US is realistic with Trump, under Trump administration, do you think that they may go to the Houthis and recognize them as a legitimate party in Yemen?
I mean, again, I don't think this is something that would be a near-term issue. My sense of being here is that very much the U.S. has moved on to other priorities. I mean, President Trump has said publicly that essentially leaving the window open to returning to some kind of strikes in Yemen, right, if this doesn't hold. And then also very clearly indicating Yemen is not a priority. At times he also did praise the Houthis for their braveness on the battlefield. It was this fascinating time in the social media space. But yeah, I think that really, again, I'll go back to what I said. I think the U.S. has bigger priorities in the Middle East right now, and they are really looking at Saudi Arabia and Gulf allies in particular as the center of gravity for kind of this new Middle East, for really, I mean, enormous financial, engagement and relationship, military, AI, all this stuff in the Gulf. That affects, U.S. interests directly, and then also this relationship with Iran. So again, I don't think that's going to be a top priority, and I think the way this will develop over time probably will be very connected with how Saudi Arabia views, and.
But recently, sorry for interrupting you. Recently, there is many rumors or reports about the China involvement, and the obsession of China, especially with Trump. So the China involvement in Yemen and the weapons of China. So it could be reason for more intervention in Yemen.
And I think China and Russia, right? So, I mean, Yemen, while it's not a priority, it's an area where both the Russians and the Chinese have a toehold in both the north and the south of Yemen. So it will be interesting. While the U.S. might not be focused on that right now, I do think, this Middle East is generally a place where both China and Russia view, as an arena of competition with the US. I think we'll have to see how that develops over time. It certainly played strongly in the US media, right, when there were reports of Russian assistance with targeting, US vessels and then some reports of Chinese. But again, it's not really at the top priority right now. One point, Mesa, if you don't mind, to comment on the US have a plan, because I think it's a really, it's a really interesting one. And I think in some ways there was a plan, and in some ways a complete lack of one, right? So, I mean, it's been widely reported that CENTCOM had been preparing for an escalation under Biden, and they were being kind of kept on a leash, essentially, right? They had ideas of what they want to do. So there was a military plan very much. But what we saw, particularly in that Signal chat, which gave us a window, a brief window on this debate internally in the Trump administration, was that there was no real, real trigger for starting, right? The military escalation. Oh, we could do it now. We could do it next week. You'll probably do it in a few weeks. It wasn't very specific in terms of when it started. And what was really clear is that there was no kind of interagency coordination. Like this idea that you would have a military plan plus like a political request, diplomatic off-ramp, do you know what I mean? Coordination with Gulf allies, right? And with the Yemeni government, that would have been able to use whatever military advantage was there towards something. I mean, that was just, I think, sorely lacking. So as the military carried out a plan, which they were very clear needed more time, the Trump administration came under pressure here for spending so much money, for losing so many Reaper drones, right? And there was no kind of end in sight. And then those conversations with the Gulf allies and possibly, Yemenis talking about this push on the ground that was long rumored. I mean, that was clearly not discussed before. So that's
Okay, thank you so much. So we replied on احنا ردينا على جولز.
We've answered the first question, the question by Jules, and now we have another question from Anel. It says, what has been the economic and humanitarian impact of the FTO designation of the Houthis? Ahmed, could you please answer this question?
ايه بالنسبة
Yes, of course. There's an impact in the short term, and there's also the long-term impact. And for us to better understand what's happening, it's important for us to first look at what entities have been sanctioned, how similar entities were sanctioned in other geographies. So, for example, in Syria, you had Caesar's law, which is very different, but there are many economic aspects that might be similar. Also, with regards to Hezbollah, for example, they had an FTO designation, and there were many similarities with the designation. But yes, I know the context is different, but there's some comparative context. What's happening in Yemen, I believe, is going to be worse because most of the population under Houthi authority is significant, is much larger, and so the FTO and the economic sanctions will add an additional complication to the already deteriorating humanitarian situation. So that's the first point. Secondly, the designation affects not just the areas under the control of the Houthis, but also the areas under the control of the government. When it comes to the network of importers importing goods in Yemen, they don't differentiate. The sanctions don't differentiate between those under the Houthi areas or areas under the control of the government. For outside companies and banks, they see it all as being part of Yemen. It's a small market that isn't worth it, isn't worth the compliance efforts. And what's worse than that was something that was mentioned earlier. With regards to the Houthis, the ideas of sanctions in the short term will not have an impact on them. And that's what we've seen with Hezbollah. Hezbollah was the most able to adapt to these sanctions because sanctions would usually target more fragile groups. But in the long term, the Houthis understand that these sanctions will have an impact on the group, and so this will affect the decision by the Houthis to start a battle. They will not accept remaining isolated without economic revenues while having under the control this large military arsenal that they can use. And so when it comes to Houthi decision making, these sanctions, I believe, will encourage them to escalate, at least internally, towards the areas that are oil rich or have economic revenues. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to some of the participants who have raised their hands. And I also encourage you to please be as brief as possible in your question. We'll start with Nabila Al-Hakimi. Over to you, Nabila. Nabila, can you hear us? Oh, yes. Can you hear me now?
صباح الخير.
Hello, everyone. My question, well, first, I would like to thank the panelists and the Sana'a Center for this session.
عندي سؤال هو الآن
I had a question.
ينشر بأنه في هناك
We've seen rumors that about the roadmap, that there is a roadmap that has been proposed by Oman that includes a potential settlement, and leaks over the past week have stated that this roadmap, there have been some signatures on it, and that Egypt will sponsor the roadmap and be a guarantor of its implementation. But my question to Abdul Ghani is, how correct are these reports of this news of a roadmap, and will it have an impact, or is it as you have said, that we're still in the same level of regional competition and rivalry, and that doesn't seem to be likely. Thank you very much. We'll take a question also from Turan Al-Haddad. Or yes, Turan, please be brief if you can.
Okay. هو سؤالي
Thank you. My question is, if the agreement between the US and Iran fails and the Houthis go back to carrying out attacks in the Red Sea, do you think that the resumption of the campaign against the Houthis will go back to where it was before, or will it escalate beyond that? Okay, thank you very much. Abdul Ghani, the question is to you about the many rumors we've seen over the past 2 weeks about negotiations in Oman and a potential agreement. There are no real indicators that this agreement is real. And also with regards to the signing, that's impossible, because the most that could be done would be for people to go back to a dialogue. That's for them to actually sign an agreement. That will take a much longer period. And the Omanis, the Omanis have made proposals for de-escalation, but not for a final settlement of the conflict. If there are serious negotiations in the future, they will take months or even years for them to reach a final agreement or settlement. Do you think, also with regards to the scenario that Turan asked about the possibility of the US resuming its airstrikes, what would that look like if the Houthis resumed their attacks in the Red Sea? I don't know if I understood his question correctly. Like I've said before, this is linked to how the negotiations with Iran pan out. There's no doubt that the Americans have tried to avoid, as much as possible, since the 7th of October, they've tried to avoid any attack on Iran, despite the internal pressure from the Zionist lobby in the US. And in all cases, before any strikes are carried out against Iran, they'll have to, before confronting the Houthis, I think the US will try their luck with the Houthis. Maybe a strong strike in Yemen might change Iran's negotiating position or posture. And so I think the possibility is them carrying out a strike in Yemen, one that is that causes significantly more damage, especially after they found out that the previous round of strikes did not have as big of an impact. I think they'll directly target cities in urban areas. Thank you very much. Yes, and I had a question for you. One final question. If you have any ideas of whether the Houthis will escalate internally due to the economic pressure that they are under. Have there been any preparations by the Houthis to do so? because we've heard talk of a potential battle in Marib. I agree with Ahmed's position that he said that continued sanctions and pressure against the Houthis will make the Houthis in the long term, or will have an impact on the Houthis in the long term, and will force them to try to start or resume the internal conflict. There are several strategic
العقوبات يعني بالحصول على موارد اقتصادية نفطية.
And they could try to deal with these sanctions by taking control of oil-rich areas in Marib. This will help them overcome the difficulties posed by the sanctions and the economic war. And so the Houthis might head in that direction. But I also confirm that this is also linked to the regional and international situation and the current geopolitical conflict. And that's what the Iranians have recognized, that the US does not want a conflict at this time, and so the Iranians, through their pressure to do that, and the US is trying to avoid external and internal pressures like Abdel spoke about, but they also and I agree with what Abdel said about that if the Iranian nuclear negotiations fail, the war might resume with significant strikes in Yemen, but there would also need to be a ground defensive at the same time. Any attack against Iran also requires taking control of the areas controlled by Iranian allies or partners in the Red Sea, and that cannot be done unless the Houthis are removed from the areas that they control, around 120,000 square kilometers that they control, that have allowed them to deal with the pressure against them. His voice keeps going in and out. Sorry, Yasser, we can't hear you, but thank you very much. April, final question.
If there is an agreement between the Americans and the Iranians.
الدخول
Sorry, Yasser, you're back.
علاقات مباشرة معها أتحدث عن الصين وعن روسيا.
And here they might try to build direct relationship with international actors like China and Russia, and I think that's what made the American position change towards the Houthis. And I think in the coming month, or especially in June and July, these are going to be very decisive when it comes to the conflict in the region and also the conflict in Yemen. Thank you very much, Yasser.
Abril, if there is an agreement, if the US and Iran reach to an agreement, do you think Yemen will be part of it? I mean, Iran intervention and its policy in the region will be one of the dimensions of this agreement, because you know that the Gulf states were absent from by Obama because he reached to a concluded agreement with Iran overlooking the Iranian policy in the region. Do you think this could be in the agenda?
I think it's an excellent question, right? Because it would have a real effect on Yemen. It doesn't solve all of Yemen's problems, but it certainly has an effect on it, right? And so we know, like as you said, the Gulf actors have been making this argument that this needs to be more than the nuclear file. It needs to be an agreement on at least, ballistic missiles and kind of support. I don't know how it would be framed. Of course, what's happening is decision-making is so narrowly focused now, right? And in the US, and obviously this is an ongoing negotiation, so the file is so closely held. So it's difficult, right, to know what's actually on the table right now. So there's no real information out there, but I think it is, it is possible. And, if there is an agreement on kind of broader de-escalation, then it can have an impact on Ansar Allah's calculus in Yemen, particularly if the Iranians are willing to limit, limit weapons, right? Limit military support for Ansar Allah. That will have an impact on their calculus.
أحمد أنا هكفل معك.
Thank you very much, April. Ahmed will conclude with you. We've gone a bit over time, but Ahmed, could you please, maybe in a minute or so, tell us, is Yemen today closer to war or to
هذا
peace?
السؤال يحتاج
I
زمن
think that's
عشر ساعات.
that question will need a lot more than a minute for me to
خلينا
answer.
نحاول نقرب الفكرة.
Well, let's try to be as brief as we can. I think that
يقف في المنتصف
I
يعني
think Yemen
تتساوى
is in the
تماما
midway point at this point. I
فرص
think it's just as likely for there to be
وفرص
opportunities for a
الذهاب باتجاه
settlement and
الحرب
then also the
وخصوصا
opportunities
انه كثير من
for renewed
الفواعل
war, especially since many of the actors
نشطة في الفترة الأخيرة
have become
واللي
more
باعتقادي
active
أنا حصل
in
في
the recent
السنتين
period.
3 سنوات
And I
الأخيرة
think
هو
what's happened over
دخول
the
احنا
past
دائما
2 or
نقول
3
انه
years, we've always
الصراع في
said
اليمن
that
متعدد
the conflict
الطرفات
in
اللي موجود
Yemen
في
is
شق
a
محلي شق إقليمي
multi-dimensional and
شق
multi-level
له علاقة بالجانب
conflict with a
الوطني
local
بس اليوم
conflict, with a
التعقيد
national
الإضافي
conflict,
هو
and also
الدخول
regional
الجانب
conflict.
الدولي
But now the
إسرائيل
international
أمريكا
community has
الصين
gotten
اللي
more involved,
ممكن حدث ما
Israel,
بين
the
دول
US,
أخرى وينعكس في
and the
حال اليمن
potential conflict that might
فبالتالي
occur between other
يعني
states
هي حالة
and be reflected in
سائلة
Yemen. And so
وممكن
it's a
تتجه
very
في
fluid and
كثير
dynamic
الاتجاهات
situation that might
مع
go either way,
الانصراف بدون
honestly. I think
تعقيد
it'd be
واحد
difficult for us
أكيد
to
أيوة
say
ولا.
one way or the
يلا
other.
شكرا جزيلا،
Thank you very
نشكر الجميع
much.
على
Thank you,
الحضور.
Ahmed. Thank you all to all
وأتمنى
of
أن
the
نكون
panelists.
استفدتوا
Thank you to our audience for
واستمتعنا
being
في
here. I hope
الجلسة،
that
وشكرا
this
جزيلا
discussion was
لجميع
beneficial to
الحاضرين،
everyone.
الدكتورة عبر العلي
Thank you very much,
وأستاذ ياسر
April,
صالح من التدريب
Yasser,
العسكري، وأستاذ عبد الغني الإرياني
Abdulghani
الباحث في
Al-Iryani,
الصنعة، وأخيرا
and Ahmed.
أستاذ أحمد
Thank you all
ناجي
for your time and for your
مسؤول هناك في
insight.
اليمن في مجموعة الأزمات
Thank you all
الدولية.
very
شكرا
much.
جزيلا.